A few days ago, I watched a video that was posted by CivilNet TV about a young man, a student really, who had been conscripted to fight in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh and who had gone missing in action for some 70 days. Arthur Harutyunyan was recounting his story about how he and his friends moved from village to village, how they tried first to go to Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh for the Armenians, and then they decided rather to go to Iran, how they split into groups, each group going in a different way. The good thing about the story is that Arthur was finally found, located, and he was taken back to Armenia where his mom was waiting for him, and he sounded quite chirpy, quite upbeat. A remarkable story. And what struck me in this story, apart from the courage that this young man showed during his days missing in action, was the fact that he never used the word Azerbaijan or Azerbaijanis in the video. He always referred to them as the enemy. I thought that was quite interesting for a very young man who had just come back from a very frightening experience. And at the same time, when I finished watching that one, and I was still on the CivilNet TV website, I also located another short 5-minute clip by Eric Hakopian on his new program called Insights, in which he talked about a culture of incompetence in Armenia. He went through a whole range, a whole host of examples as to what culture of incompetence means and how this culture of incompetence, as he called it, contributed to the bitter defeat of Armenians and the loss not only of the 7 surrounding occupied regions, but also of parts of Nagorno-Karabakh that Armenians call Artsakh. Those were 2 very interesting short clips for me to watch. And interestingly enough, at the very same time that I watched those, I had actually found another website almost by sheer happenstance that basically posts stories as it describes itself from Bishkek to Berlin about different situations across different parts of the world. And the image I have behind me comes from something called the War of Memes. And it basically talks about how Armenians and Azeris in the diaspora have been fighting through technology, through memes, against each other and trying to push their own version of events, their own version of history, and their own version of what should happen in the Southern Caucasus. But is this the only version? Is it all a question of enemies? Azerbaijanis calling Armenians enemies, Armenians calling Azerbaijanis enemies? Is it all a question of incompetence? Is it all a question of war of memes? Or is there something slightly encouraging in the midst of a vitriol and bitterness and lack of communication? Welcome to my latest YouTube episode on Nagorno-Karabakh. This is number 15. It is easier to make war than it is to make peace. This is not me sharing any wisdom with you. This is something that a lot of you also know. But there are people who buck the trend, who go against the tide, who swim against the public opinion, and who try to show that it is not by attacking each other and criticizing each other that we manage to establish the foundations for some future peace. That also became evident to me, not only from my own studies and observations and experience in, say, the Middle East region, but also in an article, an opinion piece that was posted in Al Jazeera some 1 week ago by two co-authors who'd written the piece together, the opinion together. They were Emin Milli, an Azerbaijani, and Georgi Vanyan, an Armenian. The piece basically talked about how the key to lasting peace in the Caucasus is reconciliation, coming together to re-establish mutual trust, particularly by the older generations whose memories take them to the period before the conflict, where Armenians and Azerbaijanis did actually live together in some sort of a peaceful setting. Now, the interesting thing about Emin Milli and Georgi Vanyan is that they are not what you would call institutional figures. They are not what you would call the normal politician or the normal activist. Both of them are not necessarily viewed very favorably in their own countries. Georgi Vanyan, for instance, has quite a reputation, I understand, in Armenia due to his strong anti-war and anti-nationalist positions and his rather harsh criticism of Armenian mainstream political and historical discourse, as well as the role played by Russia in the conflict. And of course, if you search him, if you look for what he's written in the past, if you go and look at what his institute represents, you would see that one thing that comes out time and again is the Georgian village of Tekalo as a peace center at the intersection of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. That, in his opinion, might be a good place for Armenians and Azerbaijanis to come together and to talk in a sort of informal way about the conflict, where they were in the past, where they are today. Emin Milli, on the other one, is a human rights activist. He's a dissident blogger. He was also a former political prisoner, and also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the founder of or director of Maidan, which publishes news in Azerbaijani, English, and Russian languages. I'm going to quote here one short paragraph of what they write in this opinion in Al Jazeera English to give you an idea of where they were taking us. They write, as an Armenian and an Azerbaijani, and I'm quoting, we know that mistrust remains rife between our two nations. No political agreement on its own can convince two peoples divided by 30 years of conflict to trust each other and make peace. Armenian and Azerbaijani civil societies, however, can forge footholds upon which real peace can stand by launching initiatives that would bring the two communities together and allow them to understand each other. End of quote. So you can already see from this, in the very short, brief, discursive introduction I gave you of the two co-authors and of their approach, it's basically one that highlights talk, don't make war, war. And at the same time, this idea I proposed about the village of Tekalo, where people could meet, sit down, negotiate, and find a way to establish real peace amongst these two peoples and in this Southern Caucasian conflict. Now, interestingly enough, take this and then take what Arthur Harutyunyan was saying, that young, brave, courageous young man, the student who wants to go and do engineering at the American University of Armenia, by the way, he was talking about the Azerbaijanis as the enemy because he's so impacted by his own experiences. And here are two co-authors talking about let's sit and talk to each other and try to find a foothold for peace. Now, this is quite interesting, and the reason it caught my attention and the reason why I'm sharing this with you in my 15th episode today is simply because many moons ago, when I was doing my law studies, my postgraduate law studies, I also did a course, quite a long course actually, in alternative dispute resolution. Now, alternative dispute resolution is the fancy legal way of saying conflict resolution. And it was very interesting for me to do this in the context of my own background and involvement with the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf regions. However, when I was asked by the professor to write a treatise on the subject, I did not choose any of the conflicts in the MENA and Gulf regions. I chose the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. My treatise was submitted, it was accepted. I think it was good, and it's somewhere in one of the shelves of some of the libraries of universities across the United Kingdom. But in that treatise that I wrote, which looked at the history, the geography, the people of the region, and how they contribute to issues of war and peace, to the various initiatives across those 2 decades that have impacted both peoples. And then I basically suggested ways forward to try and find a solution. And in that treatise, I basically talked a little bit about what the 2 co-authors of that opinion piece in Al Jazeera are basically saying. But I spoke about citizen diplomacy. I spoke about T-group resolution, and I talked about 2-track diplomacy as examples where the process of interactive problem solving occurs. These are attempts, tools, ways that aspire for a change at the societal level, and that might result in a change of people's attitudes. So I'm all for it, because at the end of the day, they foster gradual trust rather than fester threats. But is it possible to do that? I know that in Northern Ireland, there were many attempts at people-to-people workshops, dialogues on a civil society basis. I also know that there have been, and there still are actually, despite the atrocious political realities in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are still people who are bucking the trend, who are swimming against the tide, and who are sitting together trying to find common cause, trying to find a common ground, a foundation upon which they could both coexist together in a small geography of land, such as Nagorno-Karabakh, such as the Southern Caucasus, such as Israel, Palestine, such as Northern Ireland. So one way, therefore, that I suggested in the treatise is workshops, bringing together representatives of parties to the conflict. Now, the question, of course, is who are those people? How much will the rest of the population, the overwhelming majority of the population, in this case Armenians and Azerbaijanis, listen to people singing kumbaya, as it were, and saying, let's make love, not war? Now, I'm not being ironic, I'm not being dismissive. I know this is a little bit rank in a sense to use such language, but this is basically it. Let's sit and talk rather than make war. Who is able to do this? And how is it possible to engender such workshops? On their own, I don't think they are useful. On their own, I don't think they actually provide the solutions or show us the way forward in terms of resolving a conflict. In other words, they are not a substitute to negotiations. To talk about people-to-people contacts, to talk about all these attempts at citizen diplomacy, at T-group resolutions, even at two-track diplomacy on their own, cannot work if there aren't also negotiations happening at the state level. These efforts, these tools are only complementary. In other words, this is part and parcel of what is known as social sciences as peace education. A method, a way of turning intractable conflicts into tractable ones. As somebody told me one day when I was involved in such a workshop, she said to me, Harry, at the end of the day, our motto is simple. Humanize, don't demonize. Now that is powerful. Humanize, don't demonize. Because most of what I've heard from both sides on the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict and elsewhere across the war where there are situations of conflict is a process of demonization because of the hatred, the hurt, the pain, the loss, the gain, the victory, the defeat, the cultural disparities. Everything lends itself to shouting, to bickering, to warring. And it's far, far more difficult to say, you know what, despite everything, let's sit down and talk. So basically, having watched the video with Arthur Harutyunyan, having also read the opinion piece in Al Jazeera by those two Azerbaijani and Armenian dissident authors, I would say, if I'm allowed to describe them as such. I don't know them, by the way. If I look at my own write-ups, my own involvement in two-track diplomacy, what I would say is simply that it is good, it's a blessing to have people who go against the tide, who show us a different way of dealing with situations, whose motto is not necessarily win-lose, which eventually leads to lose-lose, but also win-win. And it is in this context only that I would say maybe, just maybe, my treatise is old. It's gathered dust on the shelves of university libraries. Today, the reality of the situation is that we have very vivid, live feelings on both sides. Azerbaijanis are basking in their victory. Armenians are trying to grapple with their defeat. The war of memes, the image I'm using, is a simple manifestation of that angst, that anger, or that jubilation, as it were, from the other side. So perhaps as the countries, as the politicians of both countries, as the mediators, in this case, Russia, but perhaps also the OSCE will shift gears and become more involved rather than forget about it because they've stopped killing each other and therefore refreeze a conflict which would then produce more problems in the future. While these people are doing their job, if they're doing it, workshops could continue. It's basically a way of people coming together, sitting together, discussing issues together, rediscovering the humanity of the other, delving once more deep into memories of how they were and how they could be, and perhaps taking those impressions to their own communities, sharing it with their own communities. This is not something that I do it, and then I'm so proud of myself that I went and spoke with an erstwhile enemy. No, that is pointless. The point is, how do you market? How do you sell? How do you share those ideas with others? So there is a gradual change. And that, plus who does the workshops, is the key to their success or failure. So basically, a ray of hope, I don't know. The possibility that something good could come out of this, I don't know. All I would say is that it helps to talk. I used to say this with people who would come to me in cases of divorce or in other cases where they were fuming at each other, the two parties. They would sit together and suddenly, gradually, they would discover that there are threads that they could sew together. Perhaps the same could be done about the conflict in the South Caucasus. Now, I've often said it, and I'll repeat it again. I'm not an expert on the Southern Caucasus. I'm also an Armenian, so I have my own affiliations and I'm my own beliefs. However, I'm somebody who also thinks that peace education and peace efforts are also a complementary, subsidiary way of moving forward in peacemaking. So all I can say to the courageous, brave Artur Harutyunyan, to everybody who's working on ways of bringing communities and countries together, good luck to you. And also, by the way, stay safe. Be careful with the COVID pandemic. All the best.